The story is titled 24 Hours to Execution, The Death Row Inmate Who Cheated the Chair. They call it The Watch. It's not a room and it's not a cell. It's a coffin with the lid left open just enough for you to breathe the stale, recycled air of Riverbend Maximum Security one last time. I sat on the edge of the bunk, my hands resting on my knees, watching the dust motes dance in the shaft of artificial light that buzzed overhead. It was 6:00 p.m. That meant I had exactly 24 hours left before the state of Tennessee put 2,000 volts through my body. My name is Caleb Vance, 34 years old, male, and for the last 12 years, I've been a number on a spreadsheet, a line item in a budget, and a monster in the headlines. They said I killed a guard during a botched transport. The truth didn't matter anymore. The appeals were dead. The governor wasn't picking up the phone. The only thing left was the hum of the ventilation and the heavy rhythmic thud of boots on the polished concrete outside. The transfer from the main death row block to the death watch area is designed to break you. They strip you, search you, cavity search, fingers probing where the sun doesn't shine, just to make sure you aren't smuggling a razor blade to cheat them of their show. And then they march you down a corridor that smells like floor wax and old fear. You leave behind your books, your photos, the tiny ecosystem you built in your 6x9 world. You arrive here with nothing but your skin and the jumpsuit they give you, which somehow feels heavier than the chains. Comfortable, Vance? The voice belonged to Sergeant Miller, 45, male. He was a thick-necked bulldog of a man who smelled of chewing tobacco and aggressive cologne. He stood on the other side of the bars, his thumbs hooked into his duty belt. He liked this part. He liked seeing the hope drain out of men. "Just enjoying the view, Sarge," I said, my voice raspy. I hadn't spoken in 6 hours, thinking about redecorating. Miller chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "You got a real sense of humor for a dead man. Chaplain's coming at 1900. Don't keep him waiting." He walked away, his keys jingling, a sound that used to drive me crazy but now just sounded like a clock ticking. This was the arrival, but not to prison. It was the arrival at the end of the line. The numbness I felt wasn't shock. It was armor. For 12 years, I had prepared for this day, not by making peace with God, but by studying the architecture of hell. Riverbend is a fortress of brick and wire, but every fortress has a flaw. The flaw here wasn't in the walls, it was in the ritual. I knew the protocol better than the guards did. At 6 p.m., shift change. At 7 p.m., chaplain visit. At 8 p.m., final meal request processing. Then the long silence until the prep begins the next afternoon. They assume that once you're in the death watch cell, you're done. You're under 24-hour surveillance. A guard sitting at a desk 10 feet away, watching you through the plexiglass front of the cell. But arrogance is a blinder. They see a body waiting to die. They don't see the eyes watching back. The guard on duty now was a kid named Officer Holloway, 23, male, new, green. He was reading a paperback, glancing up every 30 seconds like the manual told him to. He looked terrified. Good. Fear makes people clumsy. I lay back on the thin mattress, staring at the ceiling. I could feel the adrenaline pooling in my stomach, cold and acidic. Most guys spend these last hours crying, praying, or screaming until their throats bleed. I had to stay perfectly still. I had to lower my heart rate. I had to look resigned, because I wasn't waiting for the chair. I was waiting for the storm. 3 weeks ago, I'd paid a lifer in the laundry, a guy named Preacher Evans, 60, male, 5 packs of cigarettes to tamper with a specific valve in the basement steam tunnels. It was a long shot, a slow burn sabotage designed to stress the HVAC system during the hottest week of July. The heat had been building in the block for days. The pipes were groaning. If Preacher had done his job, and if the old iron held out just long enough to reach critical pressure, the chaos wouldn't be a riot. It would be a mechanical failure of catastrophic proportions. But timing was everything. If it blew too early, they'd just lock us down and I'd die in the dark. If it blew too late, I'd be dead anyway. I closed my eyes, listening to the hum of the prison. It's a living thing, a beast that breathes. I listened for the stutter in the air conditioning, the rattle in the vents. "Hey," Holloway called out, his voice wavering slightly. "You want water or something?" I opened one eye. I want a whiskey, neat. Can't do that, Vance. Water, then. He stood up, fumbling with the keys to the small slot in the door. I watched his hands, shaking. He was thinking about me frying. He was thinking about the smell of burning hair. He wasn't looking at the vent cover above the toilet, where the paint was just slightly chipped, where 12 years of vibration and a loosened screw, worked on by 3 generations of inmates before me who passed the knowledge down like a holy text, held a fragile secret. I took the paper cup. Thanks, kid. He nodded, retreating to his desk quickly. I drank the water. It tasted like rust. 23 hours left. The walls felt like they were closing in, physically pressing against my chest. This is the part they don't tell you about, the suffocating weight of the inevitable. You start to doubt yourself. You start to think maybe the chair's the easy way out. Just sit down, close your eyes, and let the lights go out. But then I thought about the guard they said I killed. I thought about the evidence box that went missing. I thought about the DA who ran for Senate on my conviction. Rage is a better fuel than hope. I crushed the paper cup in my hand. I wasn't going to that chair. Tonight, Riverbend was going to bleed, and I was going to be the knife. The chaplain arrived right on schedule at 1900 hours. Father O'Malley, 62, male, a man with a soft face and hands that had never held anything heavier than a Bible. He stood on the other side of the bars, the plexiglass barrier muffling his voice, turning his offer of salvation into a dull drone. "Are you ready to make peace, Caleb?" he asked. He didn't look me in the eye. They rarely do. They look at your chin or your forehead, anywhere but the eyes of a man they're about to kill. "I'm ready for a lot of things, Padre," I said, leaning back on the cot, keeping my heart rate slow, rhythmic. "But peace isn't on the menu tonight." He sighed, made the sign of the cross, and left. He was just another part of the machinery, checking a box on a form so the state could say they offered me spiritual counsel before stopping my heart. Then came the meal. 8 p.m., the last meal. It's the part everyone outside focuses on, like it's some great benevolence. I'd ordered a steak, rare, with fries. What I got was a grisly slab of well-done beef and cold potatoes on a paper tray, slid through the slot by Officer Holloway. "Eat up," Holloway mumbled. He looked pale. The air in the unit was getting thick, heavy. I ate mechanically. Not because I was hungry, but because I needed the calories. Fuel. You don't drive a car into a wall on an empty tank. Every bite was ash in my mouth, but I swallowed it down. I watched Holloway while I chewed. He was sweating. He kept tugging at his collar. "Hot in here, boss?" I asked. Holloway looked at the thermostat on the wall behind his desk. "AC's acting up. Maintenance is aware." I looked down at my tray to hide the smile. Maintenance is aware. They weren't aware of anything. Preacher Evans had done his job perfectly. The old steam system in Riverbend was a closed loop. If you jammed the relief valve in the laundry sector and spiked the boiler pressure, the excess heat had to go somewhere. Preacher had diverted it into the ventilation exchange for the solitary and death watch block. By 10:00 p.m., the cell felt like a swamp. The air was stagnant, smelling of mildew and impending rain. The plexiglass front of my cell began to fog up from the temperature difference between the humid interior and the slightly cooler guard station. Holloway was wiping his forehead with a handkerchief every 2 minutes. "Jesus," he muttered, picking up the phone. "Control, this is Watch 1. It's a sauna down here. The prisoner is sweating profusely." "Over." He was worried about me dying of heat stroke before they could kill me legally. The irony was suffocating. I moved to the toilet. Above it, the vent grate was a small square of painted steel, held in place by 4 screws. To the naked eye, they were rusted shut. But I knew the history of this cell. A guy named Tico Alvarez had spent 6 months in this box 5 years ago. He'd spent every night working those screws with a sharpened spoon handle he'd swallowed and regurgitated. He never got out, died of a heart attack before his date, but the legend of the loose grate had passed through the whispered network of the yard. I sat on the toilet lid, my back to Holloway, pretending to be sick. "You okay, Vance?" Holloway's voice was distorted through the glass. "Just the heat," I groaned, hunching over. "Feels like I'm gonna throw up." "Hold tight. They're sending a tech." That was the cue. A tech meant a civilian contractor, or maybe a trustee. It meant the door to the unit would open. But I didn't need the door. I needed the noise. At 10:45 p.m., the building groaned. It started as a low shudder in the floor, a vibration that rattled the metal bunk frame. Then came the sound, a high-pitched thwack, 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 deep in the walls like a hammer hitting a steel drum. The water hammer effect. The pressure was fighting the blockage Preacher had created. Holloway stood up, his chair scraping loudly. "What the hell is that?" The lights flickered. Once. Twice. The heavy sodium buzz died, replaced by the red emergency incandescence. The hum of the ventilation system shifted from a whir to a screaming whine. Then the hook set. A deafening bang echoed from the maintenance chase behind my cell wall. It sounded like a grenade going off. A plume of white scalding steam hissed violently through the vent above my toilet, blasting into the cell. "Shit! Shit!" Holloway was screaming, fumbling for his radio. "Control! We have a rupture! Steam blowout in the watch block! I can't see the prisoner!" The cell instantly filled with hot, blinding fog. It burned my skin, stinging like 1,000 needles, but I didn't flinch. This was it. The chaos I had bought with 5 packs of cigarettes. I didn't cower. I sprang up onto the toilet lid. The steam was pouring out of the vent, which meant the pressure behind it was lethal, but the grate itself was rattling violently from the force. I wrapped my hands in the thick jumpsuit fabric and grabbed the hot metal of the grate. One hard yank. That's all it took. The screws Tico had loosened years ago gave way, stripping the rusted threads. The grate clattered onto the floor, the sound masked by the hissing roar of the steam. I looked back through the fog. The plexiglass was opaque now, a wall of white condensation. Holloway was on the other side coughing, shouting into his radio. He wouldn't open the door. Protocol said, "Secure the prisoner, wait for backup." He was paralyzed by the book. I turned to the dark, gaping hole in the wall. The chase. It was barely 18 inches wide, a vertical shaft filled with piping and conduit that ran straight down to the basement levels. It was a throat of concrete and jagged metal. I took a breath of the burning air, grabbed a bundle of cables, and squeezed my shoulders into the darkness. I wasn't just leaving a cell. I was climbing into the guts of the beast that was trying to digest me, and I had maybe 3 minutes before the extraction team kicked down the door and found an empty cage. "Hey, Vance, get on the floor!" Holloway's voice was panic-stricken, muffled by the glass and the steam. I didn't answer. I pulled my hips through, scraping skin raw against the concrete, and let the darkness swallow me whole. The escape had begun, and the first step was a free fall into hell. The chase was less a tunnel and more a throat, a narrow vertical gullet of rough concrete, rebar, and conduit that choked the breath out of you. I didn't climb down. I fell in slow motion, bracing my knees and back against the opposing walls, sliding inches at a time. The air in the shaft was thick with dust and the metallic tang of the steam leak above. Above me, the sounds of the cell block were muffled but distinct, like hearing a radio through a pillow. I heard the hydraulic hiss thunk of the unit door opening. Then the shouting started. Boots on the metal grate, the heavy, frantic voice of Sergeant Miller barking orders. "Clear the smoke! Where is he? Check the bunk! Check the corners!" A pause, then a scream of pure rage that echoed down the shaft. "The vent! He went into the walls! Lock down the perimeter! Seal the yard!" I stopped moving, freezing in the darkness, suspended 30 feet above the basement floor by nothing but the friction of my jumpsuit against the concrete. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it would crack them. If they looked down with a flashlight now, I was dead. I was a rat in a trap, waiting for the spear. But they didn't look. Not yet. They were too busy panicking, choking on the steam that was still billowing out of the ruptured line. I let myself slide again. The friction burned the skin off my elbows. My hands, wrapped in the fabric, were slick with sweat and grime. I hit a bundle of coaxial cables and used them to slow my descent, the plastic coating tearing into my palms. When my boots finally hit the basement floor, my legs buckled. I collapsed into a crouch, gasping for air that wasn't superheated. I was in the sublevel, the catacombs, the inmates called it. It was a labyrinth of steam tunnels, sewage pipes, and electrical junctions that ran beneath the entire prison complex. It smelled of wet earth and ancient rot. I didn't have a map. I had memory. 12 years of listening to maintenance trustees brag about where they smoked their contraband cigarettes. I knew that the main steam trunk, the one Preacher Evans had sabotaged, ran parallel to the storm drains, and the storm drains emptied into the Cumberland River. I began to run, not a sprint, but a low, loping crouch, keeping my hand on the damp wall to guide me. My jumpsuit was torn at the shoulder, and I could feel blood trickling down my arm, where a rusted bracket had sliced me. The pain was distant, irrelevant. I reached the junction box, a large concrete room where the pipes converge. This was the breaking point. To get to the storm drain access, I had to cross the central maintenance corridor. It was the only well-lit area down here, a 20-foot stretch of open concrete. I stopped at the edge of the shadows. There was someone there. Standing by the manual override wheel for the steam system was a figure in a gray uniform. It wasn't a trustee. It was Sergeant Miller. He must have taken the service elevator down the moment the pressure alarm tripped, trying to bypass the lockdown to manually shut the valve and save the system. He was red-faced, veins bulging in his neck as he wrestled with the rusted iron wheel, his radio squawking on his hip. "Perimeter is secure, Warden. We're sweeping the blocks. He can't have gone far." I watched him. Miller. The man who had taunted me 3 hours ago. The man who had spent a decade making men feel small. He was the only thing standing between me and the drain. I looked around for a weapon, nothing but dust and trash. Then my eyes landed on a discarded length of steel pipe, maybe 2 feet long, left behind by some long-forgotten repair crew. It was heavy, rusted, and cold. I picked it up. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the terrifying clarity of what I had to do. I wasn't a killer. At least I hadn't been when I came in. But Riverbend sculpts you. It takes away your soft parts and leaves only the bone. I stepped out of the shadows. The noise of the steam rushing through the pipes masked my footsteps until I was 10 feet away. Miller must have sensed the movement, or maybe he just felt the shift in the air pressure. He spun around, his hand dropping to the baton on his belt. His eyes went wide. For a second, he didn't see an inmate. He saw a ghost covered in soot and blood. "Vance," he wheezed, the name catching in his throat. He fumbled for his radio, his thumb pressing the talk button. "Central, I have—" I didn't let him finish. I swung the pipe. It wasn't a cinematic fight. There was no choreography. It was ugly and desperate. I struck him across the forearm, shattering the radius and sending the radio clattering across the concrete. Miller screamed, a raw animal sound, and charged me. He was bigger, heavier, fed on steak and power. He slammed into me, driving me back against the hot steam pipes. The heat seared my back. I roared, driving my knee into his groin, then bringing the pipe down again, blindly, frantically. It connected with his shoulder, then his helmet. He went down hard, his head cracking against the concrete floor. Silence rushed back into the room, broken only by the hissing steam and my own ragged breathing. Miller lay there groaning, blood pooling under his ear. He wasn't dead, but he wasn't getting up. I stood over him, the pipe heavy in my hand. I could have finished it. I could have taken 12 years of anger out on his skull. The urge was there, a dark electric current running through my arm. But that was the prison talking. That was the monster they wanted me to be. I dropped the pipe. It rang out like a bell. I knelt and tore the key ring from his belt. My fingers were slippery with his blood and my sweat. I grabbed his radio, turned it off, and clipped it to my waist, not to use, but to keep him from calling out if he woke up. "You lose, Sarge," I whispered. It wasn't a victory speech. It was a fact. I turned and ran toward the heavy steel door marked Storm Drain Access, no entry. The key, a large brass skeleton key, jammed in the lock. I twisted it with both hands, feeling the metal bite into my skin. The tumbler clicked, a sound sweeter than any choir. I shoved the door open and was hit by a wall of smell, rotting vegetation, river mud, and sewage. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever smelled. I stepped through and locked the door behind me. I was out of the prison proper, but I wasn't free. I was in the veins of the earth now, and the river was rising. I had maybe an hour before they realized Miller was down and swarmed the tunnels. My body was screaming, my shoulder was throbbing, my hands were raw meat, and I was dehydrated to the point of dizziness. But as I stared into the black, dripping maw of the drainpipe, I smiled. For the first time in 12 years, the only thing in front of me was the dark, and the dark meant a chance. The storm drain was a mile-long intestine of the city, slick with algae and the oily runoff of the world above. I moved through it in a crouch, my boots slipping on the curved concrete, the water rushing past my ankles, freezing and black. There was no light, only the faint, phosphorescent decay of organic matter, and the occasional grate overhead that let in a tease of the night sky, taunting me with stars I couldn't yet reach. My shoulder, where I'd slammed into the pipes fighting Miller, had gone from a dull throb to a screaming, jagged pain. My hands were raw meat, shredded by the cables and the rust. But I couldn't stop. To stop was to die. In the silence of the tunnel, I could hear my own breath, ragged and wet, echoing off the walls. It sounded like a wounded animal. Maybe that's all I was now. I thought about Preacher Evans back in the laundry. By now, they'd have the block on full lockdown. They'd be tossing cells, stripping mattresses. Preacher would be lying on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, listening to the chaos he'd helped orchestrate. He'd never see the outside. He gave me this chance knowing that. That kind of debt weighs heavier than chains. The tunnel widened. The smell shifted from sewage to something earthier. River mud and diesel. The exit. I reached the end of the line. A heavy iron grate set into the concrete face of the riverbank, half submerged in the Cumberland River. The water here was waist deep, swirling and angry. I shoved against the grate. It didn't budge. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in my chest. Had I come this far, beaten Miller, survived the steam, only to drown behind a rusted gate? I braced my back against the concrete arch and kicked. Once. Twice. The adrenaline that had fueled me in the basement was gone, replaced by a trembling exhaustion. I screamed, a guttural underwater sound, and kicked with everything I had left. The bottom hinge, eaten away by years of river water, snapped. The grate swung outward with a groan of metal that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet night. I spilled out into the river. The shock of the water was absolute. It hit me like a physical blow, seizing my lungs. I scrambled up the muddy bank, clawing at tree roots and garbage, dragging myself into the thick brush of the shoreline. I collapsed into the weeds, gasping, my face pressed into the wet dirt. I wasn't in a cell. There were no walls. The air smelled of gasoline and honeysuckle. The noise was overwhelming. Crickets, the distant hum of the interstate, the lap of the water. It was sensory overload. My brain couldn't process the lack of boundaries. I felt exposed, naked, small. Then came the sound I was waiting for. Thwup, thwup, thwup. A spotlight swept across the river, turning the black water into a blinding sheet of white. The chopper was low, hunting. I buried my face in the mud, pulling the tall grass over my gray jumpsuit. The light passed over me, searching the drain exit I had just left. They knew. Miller had woken up, or Holloway had found the hole. The net was closing. I lay there for an hour, shivering violently. The cold was setting into my bones. Hypothermia was a real threat, but movement was a death sentence. I watched the perimeter lights of Riverbend in the distance, a glowing orange dome of sodium lamps. I was out, but the prison felt bigger now. It wasn't just a building anymore. It was the whole world. The trees were bars. The sky was a ceiling. When the chopper circled back toward the highway, I moved. I stuck to the tree line, moving parallel to the railroad tracks that ran along the river. I was a shadow. I found a pile of refuse behind an old maintenance shed near the tracks. Garbage bags, old tires. I dug through it like a rat until I found a discarded oil-stained tarp and a flannel shirt stiff with grease. I stripped off the prison jumpsuit, burying it deep in the mud under a heavy stone. I put on the flannel. It smelled of engine oil and sweat, but it didn't say Doc on the back. I wrapped the tarp around myself and waited. At 4 a.m., a freight train rumbled past, slowing down for the switchyard. It was a monolith of steel and noise. I didn't try to jump it like in the movies. I was too weak, too broken. I waited until it ground to a halt, the air brakes hissing. I found a flatbed carrying lumber, wrapped in plastic, and squeezed myself into a gap between the wood and the steel floor. As the train jerked into motion, the vibration rattled my teeth. We picked up speed. the rhythm of the wheels on the track becoming a hypnotic lullaby. Clack, 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 clack. I watched the city fade. The lights of Nashville blurred into streaks. I saw a billboard for a lawyer, a gas station, a family car waiting at a crossing. Normal life. A life I had forfeited 12 years ago. I looked at my hands. They were caked in dried blood and river filth. I touched the spot on my waist where Miller's radio was clipped. I had turned it off, but I kept it. A trophy. A reminder. I was alive. The execution warrant would expire in 14 hours. They would legally pronounce me dead, then list me as a fugitive. But as the sun began to bleed gray light over the horizon, I realized the truth. The story doesn't end with the escape. The arrival, the routine, the breaking point, they were just the prologue. I closed my eyes, but I didn't sleep. I listened to the wind rushing past, waiting for the sound of sirens, for the bark of a dog. Freedom wasn't the relief I thought it would be. It was a vast, terrifying emptiness. I had cheated the chair, yes. I had beaten the walls. But I looked at the horizon, wide and endless, and I felt a new kind of weight settling on my shoulders. I was free, and I had never been more afraid.